It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to see the thousands of you. I'm really honored to speak here and share the stage with Tim here, and we'll talk about establishing, maintaining device trust. So let's start with an intro. My name is Yuri Bologin. I spent my prior career on vulnerability research, exploitation research, probably a little too long. Then I did a short stint at Intel Corporation for about 11 years and created open source project called ChipSec. If you haven't used it, it's a good tool. It's really difficult to use because we need to build the enterprise products, but it's difficult to use. But when you get used to it, it's amazing. It will allow you to find vulnerabilities in any x86 system very easily. Now I'm with an awesome company called Eclypsium. We have a great team. We're protecting the infrastructure and all the critical equipment from supply chain risks, from vulnerabilities and implants and all kinds of bad stuff. And Tim.
Thank you all for coming. Tim Lisko. I work at DigitalOcean, leading our security engineering and IT teams. On the security side, basically responsible for everything left of Bang, including infrastructure security and making sure that all of the product that we bring to market is safe for our customers, safe for our business, and the third equity that we keep in mind is safe for the entire internet. Prior to DO, I was in cybersecurity consulting for about 10 years, and I've always been in this industry.
We'll talk about what is it, device trust, and why is it important, and which kind of bad problems can happen if we don't establish trust in the fundamental infrastructure and all the critical devices. And Tim will walk us through what he has done at DigitalOcean, and hopefully we'll have a few points for you to adopt and start establishing trust in the equipment that you operate. With that.
Yeah. So there's an old saying, trust is earned and not given. And when we talk about trust from a security perspective, we're talking about a spectrum, represented here, that takes us from hardware devices up through a platform that's going to sling some funny memes for us to laugh at. For those of you who are at Monday's keynote, this supply chain or this chain even goes further to the left, past those firmware microcodes. We heard Anthony Blinken talk about securing the raw minerals to make the chips. But for us in this room today, we're going to focus on the finished product. There's many elements of trust along this train. And many areas that can be compromised along the way. But we're going to concentrate on the far left, at microcode. If you snap a line on this image between firmware and Grub2, everything to the right is observable in some way, shape, or form by us today. Open source projects like the kernel or init, new system D, those are all developed in open source. There's a huge community with a ton of eyes on them. And we can generally say, we can trust this. There's vulnerabilities, but we can watch them get found and get fixed as commits go up. But to the left, the idea of firmware is a little bit of a blind spot for us. Vendors have proprietary firmware code. They're pushed out in binaries. It's not that observable to most of us as practitioners. Everything, again, is observable to the right. And, excuse me. In theory, like I said, it can be inspected. So with that context, we'll go back to the old axiom. Trust is earned and not given. And for us, we believe security starts with being able to have a trustworthy device, and that provides that foundation to build upon. So how can we get to a place where we can trust this device and verify it? And verification is what we're going to talk about today as we go through all of the different components that we have to worry about and how we start layering in trust from the ground up.
Thank you, Tim. So firmware. How many of us still think that firmware is something in the EEPROM? This is a typical motherboard, server motherboard that we have. Well, it can be a PC, it's all the same. Server motherboards are a little bit more complex, but a server motherboard, we think it's kind of a hardware, but software has it in the world. Software has it in hardware. There's no hardware anymore, it's all soft-ish. And that server motherboard has 50 different components and chips. Some of them you can see here, about a dozen here. Some of them we can recognize, like a CPU and network cards and SSDs. They all run very complex operating systems inside and a lot of software code developed by many, many suppliers. Like one of those components, or some of those components, we don't really recognize much, but they exist on every motherboard, on every server on the planet, like this number 4 BMC chip. How many of you heard about the BMC chips? Like ILO, iDRAC, sound familiar? So those are baseboard management controller chips. It's a PC on top of a motherboard. There are multiple PCs on top of a motherboard, but this one is very interesting because the whole purpose of that chip is to provide remote data center administrators an ability to manage servers at the physical level, including power cycling, including reinstalling operating systems, remote KVM, reimaging firmware, everything remotely. That one chip by ASP, which is 70% of the market, server market, that runs full-blown Linux OS with entire network stack, presentation layers, web, everything. And it fully controls, manages servers remotely in data centers. And it's present on every server on the planet. So that complexity and that kind of a supply chain behind every single component is huge. That firmware in the BMC chip is not developed by ASP. It's developed by other third-party suppliers. And of course, they're using a ton of open source packages to build their firmware as well. So all of those vulnerabilities, all those risks in those open source packages and proprietary firmware and Linux, Linux-based firmware, it all ends up in chips like that. And every device is ripe for an exploitation through vulnerabilities and all that mounts of code. Now, how do we establish trust in the devices that we operate, that we rely on, that we run our workloads on? Now, we kind of solved the software security problem, right, by now, the application security. Oh, maybe not yet, but at least we have tools to observe applications, see the vulnerabilities, see what they're made of, components, see if they're malicious or suspicious or legitimate applications. We have tools to do that, at the operating system level and above, but we don't really have any ability to interrogate software running inside those chips, those components inside every device. We don't have tools, we don't have methods. They're very obscure. Usually manufacturers are not very open in terms of providing ability to inspect all of that software code. So how do we build trust in that environment when we don't have abilities to verify, right? We tend to often gravitate towards assuming trust, believing manufacturers and every device and every component that they build, and therefore kind of extending the blind trust to every manufacturers and their entire supply chain. And I think today our processes, they're good at looking at the visible state of the device, but the provenance, the authenticity, the security, and the integrity of the actual device with all of the underlying components is kind of accepted as given. So we extend the blind trust to all of those manufacturers and all of those components.
This idea of extending trust and the risk that it brings to us as an industry is absolutely nothing new. Ken Thompson wrote this quote in a paper, I think in 1984, when he won the Turing ACM Award. This quote, I think, is at the heart of what we want to talk to you about today, which is, again, instilling blind trust. at the lowest level of code. Ken was worried about the C compiler, not necessarily the computers that are running our computers now. We've gone further down the stack. But this threat is still very real. And for Ken, this was especially real because he may or may not have written a backdoor into the C compiler that he hinted at in this paper. It's a short paper, I think it's like 2 or 3 pages. It's a really wild read, probably one of the scariest mental threat modeling papers that I've seen on a compiler code. So he wasn't necessarily focused on hardware, but we are today. We have computers running computers. We have now FPGA-enabled SmartNICs that have a full stack as a PCI bus attached to another computer. Layers and layers of this code that we have to introspect and understand the integrity, understand if what we got from the manufacturer is what we expected, and to maintain and constantly interrogate that trust.
So what do we get from manufacturer? This is well, I think this is a Lenovo laptop. We get an entire device from Lenovo. But that laptop, or any other laptop, is built by 65 suppliers. It has components in it by 65 suppliers. And those suppliers, they have subordinate suppliers, around 200. And so that laptop is built by 300 companies across the globe in 39 countries. And that is the complexity that introduces many types of different risks in that supply chain that we inherit by buying that laptop. And now, in the next section, we'll go through what sort of problems can happen. Now, some of the problems are pretty obvious. Like, we can get a counterfeit equipment. It happens a lot more often than we think, even now. A week ago, someone was indicted for 6.5 years because of running 19 companies selling counterfeit Cisco equipment worth of almost $1 billion. And that equipment ended up in a lot of customers, including in the DoD, including in the Air Force, in the network supporting modern aircraft. So that dude messed with the wrong customer. That's why he got caught. But how many organizations are still using that counterfeit equipment from Cisco, or counterfeit chips in other equipment? Now, counterfeiting is, well, it's obviously malicious, but it's not intended to compromise an organization. But when you're using counterfeit equipment, all kinds of problems can happen, including, if the components are used are cheap components or the code, knockoff code, then the reliability is not there, and potentially vulnerabilities are there that can be used to exploit an organization. But inherently, it's not in order to compromise organizations. But there are other problems in the supply chain that we inherit by buying all of that amounts of equipment, and those are vulnerabilities, because we can get components in those devices running code with a ton of vulnerabilities, and without any visibility to look for those vulnerabilities, we don't know how to address them, how to patch them, how to even compensate for those vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities like speculative execution or transient execution, there are probably 3 dozen that were discovered in major CPUs. We all use them. The blast radius of those vulnerabilities is significant because those CPUs are in every device. Or vulnerabilities, the gigabyte, like the backdoor shipped with 400 motherboards by gigabyte. Or the vulnerabilities like in that chip that I mentioned a minute ago, the baseboard management controller chip. Those are remote vulnerabilities in Linux code. Some of the examples are the BMC&C vulnerabilities that Eclipsium team has discovered in mega rack BMCs that are used by 12 to 15 different server manufacturers, or other vulnerabilities, because that code is both proprietary and people tend to introduce vulnerabilities in any code, but also that code uses a lot of open source packages, which is Tim's favorite topic to discuss.
Again, the code that is running these machines, the BMCs, it's a full stack Linux. At some point, that manufacturer has produced a version that they're going to burn into the chip and ship to us. There are occasionally updates, but they aren't long-lived updates. Supportability for some of these platforms might end as soon as the device ships out. Maybe you get a few years of updates coming after it, but whatever got stamped onto that chip might have a log4j issue lingering that's never going to get an update. When you use a BMC, you often have a presentation layer, as Yuri mentioned. You might get a little Java-based pop-up to actually console into a machine. Could have log4j. Something that just came out very recently might have had a vulnerable version of XZ and that existential crisis that we all just lived through for a few days. Constantly embedded in this, and again, not having a very frequent update cycle. So how do we find these vulnerabilities? How do we keep discovering these things and get to a safe place, or at least put compensating controls to help us not be exploited from one of those vulnerabilities?
So when we talk about the open source vulnerabilities, we often tend to think about the applications that use open source packages. But speaking of Log4j, network appliances by multiple manufacturers, they've been using Log4j and had Log4Shell there. How do we know that? How do we know that XZ backdoor doesn't end up in the Linux inside BMC chips? I think that's a very complex problem that we're trying to build trust in. Other type of problems in the supply chain.
So as we're going through, we're going to just kind of enumerate a few examples, but not just attacking open source or things like that. We have attackers going after these companies because they realize the value of being able to compromise at a firmware level from a persistence perspective. Two examples that we have here are the Intel UEFI source code being leaked, which would be an incredible valuable tool for hunters to start going through, looking at the code and trying to find new vulnerabilities that they can exploit, to write exploits, to maintain persistence. We also had hackers hit MSI and get their code signing keys, meaning anything that they could push out would be accepted because those code, it could be signed. And many of those MSI devices, far out of support, that key's there. If you're still running perhaps maybe a 10-year-old MSI laptop, you may still have a vulnerable key that is going to accept signed code. So hackers are constantly looking at manufacturers and at this underlying code, understanding new ways into a system.
I got it. So we looked at counterfeit equipment. We looked at the vulnerabilities. Those represent risks. Vulnerabilities can be exploited. And sometimes manufacturers get compromised, like the MSI bootguard case, or others. Now, that's a perfect combination to start developing exploits, to start developing implants into the equipment that is live, operational. And that's what we see folks started doing. A couple of examples here. One is the Black Lotus implant. Black Lotus is exploiting a vulnerability in the UEFI bootloaders that bypasses secure boot. Why is it notorious? And you probably have seen some alerts and guidelines from CISA, from the NSA about the Black Lotus. The interesting part here is that threat actors combined the complexity of the UEFI supply chain ecosystem, combines the prior knowledge of bypasses of secure boot that were published in 2013 for the first time. And 10 years later, they used, because the world moved to the UEFI finally and started adopting the secure boot in 2020s, and they now started using those vulnerabilities in that ecosystem, in that UEFI component, to develop a full weaponized implant bypassing secure boot on most of the PC systems. And other folks like Glupteba Backdoor started using those components as well. So that is starting to happen by both the threat actors like ransomware groups, exploiting vulnerable network appliances on the network edge, like Citrix, logbit heading Citrix appliances through Citrix Bleed, and so on and so forth. But so the PCs and servers, they're not unique. Those problems persist through any type of equipment that we're using. Another good example here is APT28 was exploiting Cisco appliances. And if you remember the Jaguar Tooth malware, they were exploiting a vulnerability in SNMP parsing of iOS, Cisco iOS firmware, because SNMP object identifiers were encoded in ASN1. Now, we all know that ASN1 parsing is perfectly safe and perfectly simple. If you're interested in looking at what vulnerabilities exist in ASN1 parsing and specifically object identifiers, there are a few presentations there. I also did a talk on that specific topic, but we see that Russian threat actors here, the Fancy Bear, they've been exploiting those vulnerabilities in the vulnerable firmware code of network appliances, not just in PCs, not just in servers. Now I'm switching to Tim.
So I think one of the things that we wanted to establish a little bit of context and history of how Yuri and I got to this stage to talk to you today. And we'll bring a little bit of practical implementation of where this approach of device trust actually hits the ground. So before diving into this, again, just a little bit more context and to bring you all into the story. DIO was founded 12 years ago, and our mission is to simplify cloud computing. That mission statement kind of infuses everything that we do in our approach to problem solving within DigitalOcean. Oops, there we go. Nope, that shouldn't be there. So, well, I didn't realize that was still in there. Sorry about that. Anyway, so DIO has, over the years, grown both organically and inorganically. I'm going to focus the rest of this case study on integration, so on inorganic growth. Generally, for those of you who have been part of an integration, when you have to bring in that other company into your trusted environment, there's a few options for ways that you can do this when it comes to, and the focus is going to be on endpoints. Generally, one of the easiest options, you buy all new laptops, you lay down your trusted environment, your Windows build, your Mac OS build, your management stack, Intune, Jamf, whatever it may be, and your security stack. You give those new devices, and the old ones, maybe they get donated, maybe they're given to the employees, or maybe they're sent to e-waste. Highly trusted way of integrating new employees into your environment. Comes with a couple cons. High cost, potential for a lot of e-waste, but it's pretty frictionless. You have a well-trodden path to get those devices out to your new employees or the acquired employees coming in. One of the other options that you might have is an as-is adoption. If during due diligence you come to an understanding that your management stack and the acquired company's management stack is fairly compatible, maybe you can just bring those devices over into your environment. But that takes a lot of trust, and a lot of trust through due diligence, which generally you don't have that much time to do in a constrained integration. But brings some pros. A lot lower cost. You're not contributing to e-waste. You don't have to worry about donations. But again, you have to put a lot of faith in your ability to find trust during due diligence. So I position those two as pretty much your two standard avenues for asset integration when it comes to integrating a company. What if those options aren't available to you? What if you're acquiring a company in a part of the world where supply chains are incredibly difficult? You can't get new devices to where this company's employee base is, or getting them there comes with an incredible expense. Shipping, import tariffs, where you take maybe a $2,000 device and suddenly you're looking at about $7,500 per device to get into a country, to get those replace option endpoints into your new employees' hands. This was the challenge that we were presented with one of our acquisitions. Figuring out a way that wouldn't bring like $1 million extra cost to the integration for us. Yuri and I and Eclipsium had met when we were focused on establishing trust in a server environment, and it presented a really interesting idea. Could we push this agent out to all of the existing devices on the acquired company that we were looking at and understand if we could trust those devices that were already in the hands of the employees? Could we bring that trust up? And then, if we knew that the device was okay and trustworthy, we can start a little bit of a factory model to re-image them, lay down our management plane, and bring them into a truly trusted environment. And we found out, yes, we could. And it came with a lot of pros, mostly low cost, no e-waste, no donation process that we had to manage. And we were able to see each of those devices, what vulnerabilities existed, and if there were any integrity issues. Thankfully, we had two. We were able to pull those devices out, and the approach that we took proved itself out, which was fantastic. Now, there is some high user friction here, and it is a decently unique use case for an integration, but it enabled us to move faster and not incur an additional $1 million integration cost. So the program that we built and how we kind of stopped worrying about this and learned to trust is going to get broken down into three big pillars. Establishing the hardware trust by using a solution that will give you visibility into that. I am here with Yuri, and we did a vendor scan around this. There are some other vendors there. Find one that's going to work for you and figure that out if you ever have to go down this route. After you establish that trust and you see a clear signal that you can trust these devices, we had to then build our operating system level trust, laying down our management plane, laying down our security plane, et cetera. The great thing with some of this agent-based approach now, as Yuri mentioned earlier, we've not solved security at the operating system layer and the application layer, but we do have a lot of visibility. We have a ton of tools out there that can provide us an indication that something is breaking down in trust at the operating system level or the application layer. Now, we also have an ability to continually monitor platform trust on these devices, especially in potentially high-risk geographies. If you have executives who travel often, it's also an amazing way of continually monitoring, has anybody messed with the hardware of this device? So now we have trust maintained at the hardware level, the operating system level, and up. So, establishing hardware trust, just digging into the details a little bit more. As part of this acquisition, not only did we not have first-party supply chains, we also had a hodgepodge of vendors. This was a scrappy startup. We weren't necessarily focused on IT resiliency or strong mature IT processes. They got devices into their developers' hands so those developers could build. We had Lenovo, Apple, MSI, and a whole bunch of other vendors in there. And again, this was in a part of the world where we had to take a very strong risk lens in understanding, were those components authentic? Had they been messed with? Was there anything already there that we had to worry about? So as we were going through the thinking of this and the solution, option one, we could bring each one of these devices into an IT shop and have some poor IT analyst go to the manufacturer's website, download the latest firmware, and reflash the device in hopes that it would catch anything that might be there. That seemed incredibly intensive from a toil perspective, and each device was going to be bespoke research to get that done. Option two was a software agent solution that could provide us this visibility and give us an indication of how trustworthy this device would be. Obviously, we're here, we went with option two. I mentioned earlier, after establishing that trust in the device, we built a factory model for re-imaging these devices. We still had a user have to come into the office. They surrendered their device for 4 or 5 hours. We rebuilt the operating system and put our management stack on it. But we really focused on making this a easy process for those employees. Give them loaners, don't impact any productivity, don't impact the business, but establish that trust. And then I mentioned earlier, this continuous monitoring. We can now look at and understand, do we have any threats in the environment? And by threats, we're really focusing on integrity issues. Has anything touched this firmware where we're going to have an indicator that something bad may have happened? And we also have an insane amount of visibility into the existing vulnerabilities on those devices. And we can drive our IT shop to go make sure that we can push out new firmware, new BIOS updates to minimize some of those existing vulnerabilities. So that is a quick study of how we established device trust at DigitalOcean, and we're able to kind of overcome a very interesting challenge in an IT integration. And I think for those of you who are here and interested in this, it presents a really interesting, viable option for any of your future integrations. If you don't want to have a huge capital outlay to give new devices to an acquired company, this is an approach that you might consider as things are moving forward in an integration, to keep those devices in the employee's hands, establish trust within the areas that you care about, and move forward very quickly. All right.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. It was a fantastic case and a fun to collaborate and work on.
Absolutely.
Now, if we can live with extending blind trust to manufacturers. I don't think it's the future that we want to be in, because this is so foundational. All of the applications, all of the workloads, all the data is processed on the infrastructure. And if we can't trust that infrastructure, or we blindly trust that infrastructure, then I think a lot of things happen as a result. So how we can improve generally in that sense to start really building up trust in the infrastructure and the devices. I think CISA has been doing a great job, and the NSA more recently has been doing a great job really telling us about the problem, alerting what sort of supply chain problems and gaps happen, including major vulnerabilities or maybe major exploitation campaigns, like the Black Lotus here, or or publishing guidelines on how to mitigate those, like improving the security of the baseboard management controllers, and even more recently, how to even build the programs like the trust in the devices as part of zero trust architecture. But I won't make you read all those alerts and announcements. There are too many of them, and I think they're all great. But when I break down what needs to be done into kind of a major buckets, then one is we have to start comparing manufacturers and factoring in security, supply chain risk of the manufacturers, of the devices that they produce, the versions, the models that they have, the components they use, so that we don't end up in a situation where we have a counterfeit or maybe a low quality equipment from manufacturers or suppliers. It's I use this example with fake Coke. We probably don't want to drink fake Coke to begin with, so why would we use a subpar equipment in such a critical environment like our infrastructure? But even if we like real Coke, sometimes we don't necessarily want certain components in it, like the high fructose corn syrup. So I think in order to achieve similar with equipment, and we have to extend similar verification to our critical equipment. In order to achieve that, we need to understand which components are used in those devices. We need to understand what's in there and what code is in there, and therefore which risks exist there. Maybe vulnerabilities, maybe a very old code, old packages, or maybe some other problems, like in this case Log4j. If it ends up in one of our servers or network appliances, we want to know that. And I think this is where the SBOM, the bill of materials, software bill of materials help, or the HBOM, or the FBOM, the firmware bill of materials. I think that's where they help, and we can start mapping those to vulnerabilities, and we can start thinking about how to address them. And finally, it may be a perfect device that we want to use and operate in our infrastructure, but we need to understand if it has been tampered with by someone. We need to understand that it doesn't have any worm like that inside it, or some kind of a persistent module in one of the chips or one of the firmware software running in that device, and do that not just once, but extend that continuously, because threat actors are exploiting vulnerabilities in those devices and implant them while we operate them. So to summarize, I think the three buckets are important as understanding what our products, external products like those devices are made of. Those components, who produces them, where they were produced, what code is running there, and then map those components to vulnerabilities, to security problems that suppliers might have introduced into those components and the code running there. So leveraging all kinds of bill of materials and then mapping to vulnerabilities and scanning all those components for vulnerabilities. And finally, having some way to verify that the code running in each component of every piece of equipment that we operate is authentic, hasn't been tampered with, hasn't been modified, does not include any sort of backdoors that might have been introduced somewhere in the supply chain or persistent implants. So I think with those three, and by the way, I'm listing some of the NIST 1800 reference architectures relevant to each of those components, because NIST in National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence created reference design and reference architecture on how to address some of these for offline reading.
So, trying to get to a place where you can walk out of here with a little bit of an application and maybe a little bit of a plan of how you could research this in your own environments. This is not something that I think needs to be everywhere, this idea of the consistent monitoring of device trust. You have to take a risk-based approach to this. Where are the areas in your business, in your organization, where you have to have an extreme amount of trust and be able to verify it? In an ideal world, yes, we could do this everywhere, but in an ideal world, or in a real world, we have constraints that we have to work through. So look at your area and understand, what are the things that I truly need to protect? Maybe it could just be, if you have executives traveling the globe, focusing this on their endpoints, as an example. If you have a strong trusted computing environment, focusing it on those servers in there. But again, those circumstances are unique to your own organization. You referenced some of the guidance. There is fantastic reading out there that can help kind of develop the risk thinking around supply chain risk management. And NIST 2.0, or CSF 2.0 has some great controls and ways of thinking about the risk management of supply chain. In 3 months from now, if you figured out that you do have an application for this, prioritize and scope one of those projects. Go out and do a vendor scan and figure out who's going to be the best partner for you. I come from an organization where we love building tools in-house. DO, the engineering culture at DO is absolutely amazing. Our hardware engineers are focused on making sure that our product is incredibly stable and safe for our customers. For me, it does not make sense to try to have those engineers focus on establishing trust of our devices. There's that whole axiom of buying versus building. There are experts out there who do this vulnerability research, this hardware research daily. For me, this was, looking at this, it became this does not make sense for me to build this. Just like it doesn't necessarily make sense for me to build an entire internal identity and access management program when I might also be able to go to a vendor partner to help give me that software. So understand where you might need this, figure out what vendors are going to be right for you and your use cases, and start having a discussion around building this into your security program to gain a little bit more visibility and a lot more trust into your environment. And as you move further to the right, start operationalizing this. If you get alerts popping out of one of these tools, that is an excellent Security Operations Center use case. What happens if we detect that there is a integrity problem in one of our devices? What's the operation for pulling that thing from your environment to really go investigate it? And from there, once you get this going, you are going to have a lot more trust and assurance in the hardware in your environment. And again, you have that confidence of building something on a very solid foundation upstack. Anything to add?
Thank you, Tim. And with that, we're concluding the presentational part of the talk, and we have a few minutes for Q&A.
Cost
So the question was, how much did it cost us when we had a balance of scales between paying $1 million for brand new devices or going down this route for software? Without disclosing actual software costs and all that fun stuff, substantially less by a massive order of magnitude. Convincing the company to say, please give me a little bit of budget unlock to buy these software licenses was substantially less painful when put next to $1 million bill there. But it was far less expensive than that.
A small fraction. When ripping and replacing a networking equipment by some manufacturer for $3 billion, that's probably much less than that.
Yes.
Hello. My question goes as follows. You talked about a motherboard is made up of about more than 300 competitors coming up to make up a laptop. Now, looking at those figures of more than 300, to start with, do they trust themselves? Do they trust their products? Did they consider the risk factor for each of the components they were designing, analyzed, brought forth so much that they can integrate them into a comprehensive analysis to know exactly how can we analyze the vulnerabilities we may be bringing on to the laptop. However, from the other spectrum, we all tend to look at the laptop is trustable. We can trust it. Our devices are trusted. How do we, on our own part, trust what is not trustable? That's my question.
Do you want me to take
Yeah,
this
go
question?
ahead. I'll jump in.
Thank you for the question. So I think and we want to trust our suppliers, absolutely. We want to trust manufacturers of systems that we buy and operate. But they have such a complex supply chain behind them. They have so many third-party, fifth-party suppliers that make up those devices that it almost becomes impossible to, without a technological way, to ensure that every one of those suppliers, no matter where they are and what their security maturity is, they do the right things. So there is absolutely no assurance that all of those suppliers have done any kind of verification for vulnerabilities at this point today. So we need technological methods to do that and to inspect those components that make up devices. In order for us not to really, trust that everyone is doing the right things, but verify that trust.
Okay, I found the microphone this time. Two-part question. When looking for a software vendor to do this kind of scanning to evaluate the devices, not the Gartner kind of point of view, but what are some real key insights of what to look for in a vendor? What are some insights that not having been there before and done that, you wouldn't necessarily know, or key things to look out for that are going to be really valuable in return?
Mm-hmm. I can share a couple things, and then please jump in. One of the things that I looked for when we were going down this route was the original research coming out of some of these companies. Was it just a software company that was consuming someone else's research, or were they publishing their own and kind of demonstrating their technical expertise because of that research? That was one criteria. The other was deployment models for how we could get this out, and then standard things like pricing and that level of partnership and trust that you can have with a vendor, a little bit of the intangibles. But for me, and this is just for me, the original research was a huge differentiator when I was looking at vendors.
Thank you. Was there anything key in the what it could scan and the kind of results that it would return that was insight that you valued after having went through the process?
Yes. So looking at have you ever read change logs for firmware updates?
Sure.
And how terse they are?
Yeah.
They're like, we fixed a security issue. Which one? Maybe there's a CVE reference that goes along with it. But there were very few tools that could look at the state of your machine right now and give you a snapshot of where are the vulnerabilities that I have as confirmed by the code, not necessarily just a press release, not a press release, a changelog release or an update. Also, the industry has gotten better. Like Lenovo has their Vantage that will do system updates automatically, and I think Apple also has a great update mechanism. But when you're running massive servers, that is completely a pull to understand when that is going to happen and how and when you have to take downtime for that. Having a tool that can interrogate those things on demand makes it a little bit more, less of a pull obligation on the staff, and you can have that information pushed to you, say, oh, something has changed, the software has detected a change that I need to be aware of, and I can go sprint at that.
Thank you.
Yep. Anything to add?
Would love to, yes. Thank you, Tim. I think a couple of things. So one is because the devices are so complex, you can't really assess the entire device with any software tool. And over time, hopefully, the tools we built will mature and the coverage will increase. You have to look at which components are actually being assessed and to what level. Like checking a version of the BIOS has absolutely zero impact on really establishing trust that the BIOS is actually okay. So you have to see if the BIOS is actually extracted, and I'm using BIOS term as loosely because nobody's using BIOSes anymore, other than maybe in critical infrastructure and other critical environments. But the world moved to the UEFI, which is the operating system on its own. So it needs to be extracted. It needs to be analyzed, not just checking the versions of these components and how many of these components are actually verified and to what level. Because threat actors aren't targeting every component today. They're targeting specific things, and that intelligence also needs to be kind of accounted for in how the tools analyze those devices. And the second point is the data. This is, I probably said complex ecosystem too many times during this talk, but it is, because if you take HP Pavilion 550, it has 4,668 configurations, just one model. How do we even account for all of those configurations of each device, versions, and how do we map them to vulnerabilities that are almost never end up in NVD? Because those are hardware manufacturers, device suppliers. They, best case, they publish advisories, but that's the best case. Not everyone does at all, or even patch vulnerabilities, or even look for the vulnerabilities in their components. So how the tools collect that data about every manufacturer, every supplier, and their risks, vulnerabilities, profiles, versions, and so on and so forth. I think that data is important.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Well, we have 1 minute left. Any last questions? Okay. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for hosting us.
Thank you much.